so good to be here and see so many friendly faces already in person. As they said, I'm Rachel Robasciotti. I'm the founder and CEO of Adasina Social Capital. It's my pleasure to talk to you about social justice investing today. I think I have to hit the slide button. Oh, they skipped that one. I'll be getting to my inspiration in just a moment. But I'm delighted to be here. I'm so glad to be kicking off this conference that's about the future and what we want for our future. So it's not only about future-proofing our portfolios, it's also about future-proofing the world that we're living in. And boy, don't we wish that we had all started doing that 20 to 50 years ago. So we're going to do our best for the next generation and for the next 20 to 50 years. I just want to say that as a portfolio manager, I think we need to go back a couple of slides. I think. The clicker is not entirely connected, so if they can go back. Oh, no, okay, that's fine. We're going to go to that next slide. You're going to be looking at my family members for a while. These are actually two of my family members where I grew up in Oroville, California. Has anybody ever heard of Oroville? Maybe you heard me talking about it. There's some clapping over there. Wonderful. So Oroville is a very small rural town in Northern California. And I grew up in the South Side, the Black community there. And if you're aware of Oroville at all, let's see, we're going to go back. You might have seen the house where my family grew up. And if you were on the South Side specifically, you would see homes that look like this. These are the kinds of homes we tend to think about in countries other than the United States, but there are plenty of communities who live like this right now, and we're getting more and more awareness of that with social media and many of the other ways our world is more networked. It's really important for me to talk to you about why I do what I do, because a great inspiration of mine once said that no one cares how much you know until they know how much you care. So I want you to know why this is so deeply and personally important to me. I grew up in this family of mostly women, mostly Black women, and that's critical to understand because as a result of systemic racism, most of the men in my family and in all of the families on the South Side were either incarcerated or killed by the police. I've had 3 family members killed by police officers. And while this may not be something we talk about in finance very often, it feels really important for me to stand here as a portfolio manager in finance from the Black community and tell you that this is not an uncommon story in communities across the United States. In Oroville, the Black people that live there mostly arrived there as a result of the Great Migration in the 1930s. If you've ever heard of Oroville, other than hearing me talk about it, you probably had heard of it because there was a dam, the tallest dam in the United States, built there. And in the 1930s, the Black people moved up from the South in order to take high-risk jobs to build the dam there. They were redlined into living on the South Side. And one of the things that began to happen over the course of my life is that issues around racial, gender, and economic justice became very clear to me. You know, we were the Black community. We're also a community mostly of women. Most of the good jobs actually went to men instead of the women. So we suffered from chronic impoverishment. And then something started to happen that was a bit different in the 2010s. We started to have extreme weather. And around that time, Oroville made international news. I was coming back from a trip, looked at my phone, and Oroville was on the international news because the dam there was beginning to collapse. And that's significant because my family and all of my community had to be evacuated. And when we looked at the flood inundation map on the news, on the international news, what we saw was the same thing that the Black residents in the 9th Ward saw during Hurricane Katrina. That red area is the South Side, where all the Black folks live. And I just want to remind you, and I hope to offend your basic sense of fairness here, I want to remind you that the black people came to build the dam, taking high-risk jobs, were redlined into living and buying homes in this particular area, and it happened to be the place that was first to flood, right, if the dam were ever to collapse. What this represents is a system of exploitation and extraction, right? And it's this system that we're living in the United States that is also represented in our financial markets. But what most people don't understand is that systems of exploitation and extraction do work in the short term. What they are not is a long-term strategy. It's the same way as if you're in a small community of people, you can get away with, lying, cheating, stealing from somebody a few times, maybe early on, maybe just one time if they're very smart, but it's not a long-term strategy for survival within an interconnected community. And that's what we've learned during the pandemic, more and more. We are far more interconnected than we ever could have imagined we were. And so my whole talk is about social justice investing because I believe it is the primary way to future-proof a portfolio for the future because it turns away from the economics of extraction and exploitation that have left an imprint not only in our communities across this country, but it's also around the world, and it's really fed often by our financial markets. So I want you to know that when I say we have to bring our collective resources together to address racial, gender, economic, and climate justice, it's extremely personal for me. And when I say that we have to make this transition to a just and sustainable future, I'm thinking about a future for my family, my community, and all of the communities like it. So let's talk about what social justice investing actually is. Adasina coined the term before Adasina actually had its own official name when we were a wealth management firm previously in 2018. And essentially, we were interested in integrating racial, gender, economic, and climate justice metrics into the portfolio creation process. And that was a very different situation because prior to that, what we had was socially responsible investing, which had really become something that had evolved into ESG, or environmental social governance, which I'll talk about in just a moment. Most importantly, we wanted to truly have an impact, not just appear as though we were having an impact. And so what was most important to us was that we put people in positions of accountability and oversight over our portfolio management team, and to help ensure that the criteria and the metrics that we use actually reflected those communities' values. And that may sound a bit like an obvious choice to make, but in reality, I can give you several examples, and I will momentarily, of times when that has not happened. In finance, we have a really profound habit of talking to ourselves. And it's time that we actually start looking outside of finance to figure out what real impact means. And we think that this makes sense not only because it's part of bringing about the justice that we want to see in the world, but actually it's just the evolution of ESG. In the last decade, we've had so much money flowing into ESG, and only very recently there's been a bit of a backlash. That backlash that we've seen is specifically because those who are most impacted are starting to raise their voices. Think of the Black Lives Matter movement, the Me Too movement. Those who are most impacted by injustice are starting to raise their voices. They're impacting the outcomes of publicly traded companies. They aren't seeing their portfolios actually align with what their values are, these communities. So often the first question I get when I start talking about social justice investing is like, okay, so wait a minute, you're looking at these social issues and, what happens to the rest of the portfolio? Does that mean that you have tobacco in it? And the best way that I like to think about this is that it's really like ESG plus. So of course you aren't going to have poor corporate governance or tobacco in the portfolio, but I don't need communities that are impacted to tell me how to measure that. For that, finance can really talk to itself. But when I get down to how public market investors actually have an impact on racial justice in this country, I want to talk to the Black community. if I'm wondering how public markets investors can impact economic justice, I want to talk to the Poor People's Campaign. So this is the kind of tie in with our portfolios that I'm hoping to introduce for you today. And it's not just that we want to make a better world. We actually believe that social justice investors have a long-term advantage, and I'll show you some statistics to help prove this point, because they're aligning themselves with companies that are at the forefront of widespread social justice movements. And so, of course, you're avoiding headline risk, but truly, over time, these start to become early indicators of material risk in portfolios. And that's really important, because lots of people want to do good things with their portfolios, and they seem to leave that conversation apart from whether or not it's going to generate financial return. But I want to remind you that extraction and exploitation of communities and the planet are actually only a short-term strategy. People, investors, want long-term financial returns, and the best way to do that is by investing long-term in sustainable companies that aren't engaged in short-term practices. Let's see. And that's what we're doing at Adasina, is bridging that gap. So, of course, I'll tell you in just a moment how we actually do it in our portfolio, but when we stepped back and looked at what we were doing, and we tried to pull out the things at Adasina that actually other advisors could do, other asset managers could do, in order to bring their portfolios more in alignment with social justice movements, we started to notice that there are these basic questions that matter. You need to ask, what are the issues? If someone says that they're working on sustainability and they're only looking at climate, I would beg to differ with them in that approach, because as you can see from my own story and many other folks, racial, gender, economic, and climate justice are intrinsically linked. These other two questions about how should we measure and act and who decides impact are actually very critical. And I would say that third question is the most important. When who starts to drive what issues you address and how you act, that's when you start to get those long-term risk advantages within the portfolio. So the secret to all of this is who. So if you're looking at an issue, for example, like the Me Too movement happens, and suddenly investors want to work on gender justice, and they begin to look at women on corporate boards, that's a great measure of inclusivity. What it does not do is address the core issue, which was serial sexual harassment in the workplace. If you talk to those who are most impacted, to the survivors of serial sexual harassment and their social justice organizations, they tell you to go after forced arbitration for sexual harassment. That's an entirely different approach than looking at women, whether or not there's women on the corporate board, which is loosely related, but really is another symptom of finance talking to itself. When you start to have who, that very important who, dictate how you're managing the portfolio, how you're pulling together the metrics, what actions you're taking, and what the issues are that you're tracking, you actually start to be able to get ahead of the game. And this is very important because social issues are evolving constantly. If we've seen nothing else in the last 2.5 years, we've seen that. We've seen the fall of Roe versus Wade, and we've seen the incredible mass shootings, and of course George Floyd's murder. And I have the ability to both mourn those losses and tell you that at every turn, our portfolio was ahead because we were talking to those who were most impacted. So there's a large drop in 2020 in private prison stocks. We were never invested. In a year when the S&P 500 ultimately ended up 16%, they were down more than 60%. So, and similarly, when the Supreme Court overturned Roe versus Wade, there's a sudden look at like, whoa, are these public companies actually giving to politicians that help to ensure that this happened? And that was something that was already integrated into the portfolios that social justice investors were building. It's very important that we're able to have a proactive versus a reactive approach, because I believe that we need to redefine impact. For far too long, impact has been defined as the impact you can have on your portfolio. And it kind of makes sense. You're the asset manager. If your portfolio is large enough, you can actually speak to the company. Technically, you're representing the owners of that company. But the truth is that what we can do in our own portfolio, while it might be admirable, is nothing compared to what we can do if we mobilize other investors and get them to act in alignment with social justice movements. And so I want to just talk about these different ways that we mobilize investors, because these are tools that you all can use that we have available on the Adasina website. We want you to use them in your own portfolios. The first is impact data sets. We have a racial justice impact data set that came out in 2020 that covers all aspects of decarceration, indigenous peoples' rights, immigrant rights, and we also have some diversity and inclusion metrics there. We had so many people say they wanted to impact racial justice for years, basically, and they were just like not quite getting around to fully implementing it. So this is intellectual property that we shared with the public quite intentionally, because in listening to investors and getting ahead, we were actually able to step back and say, what do investors need in order to also act in alignment? Well, it's the data. It's the information on how corporate behavior is playing out. The other thing that investors told us that they need was the business case. Like, it's very nice that we don't want to engage in human slavery, for example, but actually, what's the business case for it? And what we do, you can find these on the Adasina website as well, is we create investor statements. And these make the business case for ending harmful corporate practices. I'm very glad to say that I've actually heard excerpts of our investor statements read on the floor of Congress. They've come out in White House briefings and in many, many public boardrooms. And that's something that you can do whether or not your portfolio is a large one. And the last but really most important thing is the thought leadership. Sometimes it's really important for us to change the narrative. So our partners in the movement are our partners on racial justice. One of many is the Movement for Black Lives. After George Floyd died, again, the industry mobilized and their clients wanted to see them doing something, the asset managers, about racial justice, and they went to look at diversity and inclusion on a corporate level, which again is a wonderful thing. There's nothing wrong with that. However, you talk to the Movement for Black Lives, they say we needed to address the system that put the knee on George Floyd's neck, and that is the carceral system. And that's what we ultimately were happily able to turn the conversation toward, was how do we decarcerate our portfolios? How do we take out our funding of a money bail system and private imprisonment for profit of individuals in this country that disproportionately targets Black and Indigenous communities? So it's not only about providing data and providing the rationale, you also have to actually engage in thought leadership that changes the narrative. And so that's why you actually see us in the media. Our communications are part of our strategy for making change. Because again, what we can do in our own portfolio may be admirable, but what we can do to organize, to mobilize and align other investors to pay attention to social justice movements, that's what's transformative. Okay, so this is how we actually do it. I want to show you the secret sauce. First, as you've already heard, we have social justice partners that give us information about what we should be doing next. I'll give you an example. We wanted to work on the issue of poverty, and we were directed by the Poor People's Campaign to work specifically on wages. And we worked with an organization, and still work with an organization called One Fair Wage, that is working on eliminating the sub-minimum wage, which was a legacy of slavery. Tipping was. It was a way of not paying freed Black women for their a full wage in the past. We worked with One Fair Wage, and they helped us create our investment criteria around livable wages. So the investment criteria is literally just like, is the what? What's the issue that you're focusing on? What's this, what are you screening for? So we did research and looked at all of the companies all the publicly traded companies, and which of them actually paid sub-minimum wages to their employees while paying their CEOs millions of dollars. From there, we also worked with One Fair Wage in order to create the impact metrics, like how are we going to measure this? And this is important because while we have 40 different investment criteria, we have 80 different screens. So those screens are basically saying that there sometimes are multiple ways of measuring a particular thing. So it's not only what we're measuring, but how we're measuring it that we're doing in partnership with social justice organizations. And from that, we actually create our investment solutions. I have to be honest and say I can't see the timer, and I want to leave time for Q&A. But I'm near the end. So let's talk about the core of this conversation. Like, does it actually work? Do you actually end up starting to build a better world? Well, I'm happy to tell you that in February of this year, we're celebrating the end of forced arbitration for sexual harassment, and that was in no small part to the work that we did organizing investors. I can tell you that private prison stocks never recovered, and in fact, in May of 2021, there was now a private prison bond offering that came to market, and for the first time in history, the bond issue completely failed as a result of shareholder activism. So there is real impact that's possible, but none of these would have been possible if we were just working on changing behavior in our own portfolio. We really had to organize other investors to pay attention to these critical issues. In fact, in our investor statement, the Newsweek article here where it says, Denny's shareholders revolt, that was a coalition of investors, $500 billion worth of investors signed on to our statement outlining the business case for ending the sub-minimum wage. So you can see there's real impact that's possible. You have to start to define it differently, and you have to create accountability with the communities that you intend to impact. And it's also important that we're maximizing returns. Let's see how that investment thesis is playing out. I hope that you can see that far enough in the back. This is our Adasina Social Justice Index, and it's a global all-cap index. If you compare it to the FTSE Global all-cap index, you can see that we're outperforming over time. And I'm very proud of that, to have impact and to be able to deliver the returns. Thank you. A really funny story. Earlier in this year, there was Tesla was a big name that impacted a lot of ESG portfolios, and I can tell you that Tesla was never in our portfolios because while they were great for climate, they were terrible on gender and racial justice issues, and we knew it for years. So these are the kinds of things that you can start to notice and integrate into portfolios when you're paying attention. Use our resources. Of course, I'd be happy if you used our products, but more importantly, use our resources so that you also can align with social justice movements. On our website, you can find that sub-minimum wage list. Check your portfolios. You can find our racial justice impact data set. Later this month, the future of climate justice is in extractive agriculture, so going beyond fossil fuel divestment and looking very carefully at how extractive agriculture is responsible, depending on who you ask, for 30 to 50% of carbon emissions, and no one's paying attention to this. By the way, it mostly impacts people of color in the global south, so it's also an issue of racial justice. Thankfully, the world's getting the message. We've had 114% growth in our first year, 41% growth in year to date, and we have over 100 million in assets in our ETF.